Let's go back a few years, before the World War II. America in the 1930s was not the unstoppable economic giant we imagine today. The Great Depression had devastated the country. Factories had closed, banks had collapsed, people had lost jobs and homes, and millions of workers were desperate for employment. But here's the fascinating part. America still possessed enormous resources. It had oil, coal, iron, agricultural land, railways, factories, and one of the world's largest industrial workforces. The problem was demand. Businesses didn't want to produce millions of products if nobody could afford to buy them. Then, Europe went to war. December 1940. Inside the White House, President Franklin D. Roosevelt was facing a strange problem.
Europe was burning. Nazi Germany had conquered much of continental Europe. Britain was fighting for survival. But America was still officially outside the war.
And Roosevelt was thinking, America eventually have to become the world's factory. But there's a problem. America had just come through the Great Depression. Millions were unemployed. Factories had been sitting idle. So Roosevelt stood up from his chair and addressed his cabinet members.
Can the same factories that had failed to provide jobs during the Depression become the factories that would supply in a world war?
His cabinet ministers' answers was yes.
Yes.
And what followed wasn't just a military mobilization. It became one of the greatest economic transformations in American history. But Roosevelt had a political problem. A large part of America wanted to stay out of the European war. So Roosevelt couldn't simply walk onto television and announce, "We're going to become the factory of the world." He had to convince Americans gradually. In December 1940, Roosevelt gave one of his famous radio fireside chats. He presented an idea that would become central to America's wartime strategy. He said,
America should become the arsenal of democracy.
If Britain fell, America could eventually face an even more dangerous world. So instead of waiting until the war reached America's shores, America could use its industrial power to help countries resisting Nazi aggression. And this led to one of Roosevelt's most important economic decisions: Lend-Lease. Instead of demanding immediate payment for every weapon and supply sent to Britain and other allies, America could provide them under a system of lending and other arrangements. Opposition denied, but Roosevelt used a brilliant analogy. Imagine your neighbor's house is on fire. You don't sell him your garden hose. You lend it to him. Why? Because you don't want the fire to spread to your own house. Roosevelt was essentially making the argument: help Britain fight the fire before it reaches America. The Lend-Lease Act became law in March 1941, and something extraordinary began happening. American factories started receiving enormous orders. Now imagine an American factory in 1941. Yesterday, it might have been making ordinary consumer products. Today, Washington says, we need thousands of military vehicles. Another factory receives an order for aircraft engines. Another needs to manufacture ammunition. Another needs steel. Another needs rubber. And suddenly, America's industrial machine begins running at full speed. Roosevelt's government didn't simply tell companies to produce more. It helped coordinate raw materials, production priorities, labor, and military procurement. The government became the customer, coordinator, and financier behind an enormous industrial mobilization. And the impact spread far beyond weapons factories. If an aircraft factory needed aluminum, someone had to mine it. If the factory needed electricity, power plants had to produce it. If workers needed to reach the factory, transportation networks had to move them. If workers received wages, they spent that money in restaurants, shops, and businesses. One government order could therefore create an entire economic chain reaction. War demand was pulling the entire economy upward. But then America encountered another problem. Millions of men were joining the military. Who would work in the factories? And this is where the social story becomes fascinating. American women entered industrial jobs in huge numbers. The image of Rosie the Riveter became a symbol of women working in America's wartime factories. Women who had previously been discouraged from entering certain industrial occupations were suddenly being encouraged to build aircraft, ships, and military equipment. The war, therefore, didn't merely change America's production. It changed the American workforce. America was discovering that its economic capacity was much larger than previously imagined, and every month, production increased. Now comes the moment that changed the global economic balance. Look at Europe. Its factories had been bombed. Its cities were damaged. Its infrastructure was devastated. Millions of people were dead or displaced. Now look at America. Its factories were still standing. Its railways were functioning. Its farms were producing. Its oil fields were operating. Its industrial workforce had just learned how to produce at extraordinary scale. America had essentially become a factory island in a devastated industrial world. And Roosevelt's administration wasn't thinking only about winning the war. American leaders were already thinking about what would happen after the war. This is where the story becomes even more interesting. Roosevelt understood that winning the war was only half the problem. What happens when the guns stop? If countries returned to economic nationalism, trade wars, and financial instability, the world could repeat the disasters of the 1930s. So American officials began working toward a new global economic system. In 1944, representatives from 44 countries gathered in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The goal? Build a more stable international financial system. The conference helped create two institutions that would become extremely important: the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The new monetary system placed the US dollar at the center, linked to gold at a fixed rate. America wasn't simply becoming the world's largest industrial power. It was positioning itself at the center of the global financial system. But America still had one problem. Europe was devastated. And a devastated Europe couldn't easily buy American products. So America had an unusual interest. Europe needed to become prosperous again. This eventually led to the Marshall Plan. America helped finance European recovery. At first, this may sound like America was simply giving away money. But think economically. If European factories reopened, European workers earned wages. If European workers earned wages, they could buy products. And if European economies recovered, American companies could trade with them. So America's post-war strategy wasn't simply, we won. It was, let's help rebuild the world and make sure America is at the center of the new economic order. Franklin Roosevelt died in April 1945, before he could see the full post-war transformation. But the system he helped build was already taking shape. America had entered the 1940s as a country still carrying the scars of the Great Depression. It emerged from the war as one of the two dominant superpowers. And perhaps the greatest economic lesson is this: a superpower isn't created simply by having money. It is created when a country can transform its resources into production, technology, finance, and influence at a scale other countries cannot easily match. World War II gave America the opportunity to demonstrate exactly that. The war destroyed enormous wealth across the world, but America's factories survived. And when the world needed to rebuild, America was ready to build. That is how the arsenal of democracy became something much bigger, the economic superpower of the post-war world. Don't forget to like and subscribe for this bizarre economic content, and comment if we are under World War III due to USA versus Iran war. And which country can become the next economic superpower?